Hello to you. I do hope you're well. Welcome to this AQA A-Level Religious Studies video. I'm Wardle, and today we are continuing our look at Paper 1 Ethics by looking at free will and moral responsibility. And for this topic, there are 4 things that we need to know. We need to know about libertarianism, determinism, compatibilism, and then we need to be applying each of those to the issues of crime, reward, and punishment. So in other words, moral responsibility. So this video will cover all of the key AO1 and AO2 that you need to know for the exam to secure an A star if this topic comes up. So let's get started with a look at this quote from Jean-Paul Sartre, who was a very famous existentialist philosopher of the 20th century. And we'll be talking about existentialism when we look at libertarianism today. And Sartre very famously said that man is condemned to be free because once thrown into the world, he is responsible for everything he does. So just take a minute to think about what that quote means and whether you actually agree with Sartre. The idea that we are actually condemned to be free, which of course makes our free will and our freedom as humans, if indeed we have it, sound very much like a burden and a responsibility. Sartre here very much representing that free will as something, as I say, that is quite a burden upon us because of the responsibility that it gives us. We often talk about free will as a gift from God, for example, when we're talking about religious ethics, but actually, is it a gift or is it a burden? Because if you are given free will, then of course that comes with moral responsibility. And so when we are talking about libertarianism today, we will talk about the implication of that for the criminal justice system and this idea of moral responsibility, that with free will, there is then moral responsibility because you can't blame other factors. You have to take full responsibility for the decisions and the choices that you've made. And actually, this is a quote I like to use in my role as a head of year as well. When I'm talking to students about taking responsibility for their choices, I use the mantra that greatness is a choice and that you need to make the right choices in order to achieve great things, both in education and in life. But of course, again, that philosophy that I'm using as a teacher and as a head of year is very much grounded in this idea that we do have free will. And so, yeah, just to start us off, I thought I would mention Sartre there, very famous existentialist and libertarian who believes that we are condemned to be free. So the fact that we do have free will means that we then have moral responsibility. So I thought we could start as well by just thinking about this little question here. How much freedom do you think that individuals actually have? So if you had to say that on a scale of 0 to 10, how much freedom and how much free will we have as individuals, what would you say? So 0 would be that you think we have absolutely no freedom whatsoever. So everything is fixed in advance. Free will is an illusion. We don't have any choices. And then 10 would be the other end of the scale, of course, the idea that we actually have complete freedom, so that we are completely in charge. We have complete autonomy over the things that we do, the choices that we make, and therefore, of course, by implication, we have full moral responsibility. So I would be really interested to hear actually in the comments below where you would place yourself on that opinion line. Would you say you think that we have no freedom, we have complete freedom, or are you somewhere in the middle? And of course, we'll be looking at where libertarianism, compatibilism, and determinism all fit in when they provide their responses to this question of how much freedom do individuals have. And of course, we'll be talking about things that might determine us from within, you know, in terms of are we shaped by our upbringing and our biology, for example. But I think it's also important to consider that in the context of society. You know, your judgment of how much freedom people have might vary on what country you're talking about or what context you are talking about. Because, of course, in some countries, people might be seen as having much more individual freedom and autonomy than in other countries around the world. So, a really fascinating topic. And I just thought we could start by asking, how much freedom do you think that individuals actually have? So, The reason that I'm asking you this is because we are talking today about free will and moral responsibility. And here are the key scholars that we'll be meeting today and we'll be talking about today. We will, of course, also be comparing their ideas and evaluating them in anticipation for potential AO1 and AO2 questions. So just a quick reminder that A-star students at A-level will include a scholar in every single paragraph. So it is so important that you are name dropping Spinoza, Kant, Descartes and Hume into your paragraphs. Make sure that you have got a key scholar named and explained in every paragraph that you write in order to secure those top marks. So we will be meeting Spinoza. He is a determinist, and actually I don't think we've spoken about him before on the course. So I'll be introducing you to him today, and we'll be hearing about his beliefs on determinism, the idea that actually we don't have any free will. And then of course we'll be looking at the implication of that for the legal system and for the idea of having moral responsibility, which of course a determinist would say we can't possibly have because we haven't actually chosen ourselves the things that we do. We then have Kant, who of course is a familiar face. He is a libertarian, and you will remember he does mention free will, doesn't he, when he's talking about his Kantian ethics and the idea that we can only reward people for choosing to do their duty if they have free will. So we'll be talking about Kant today. We'll also be talking about Descartes today. And all of our discussions from earlier in the course about his mind-body dualism are going to be very relevant and important because he believes in libertarianism and he believes we do have free will because we have that separate mind that is separate from our body. So we'll be looking at this idea of libertarianism in the context of mind-body dualism because many libertarians are mind-body dualists. And then finally, David Hume, who is, of course, a very familiar face to us. He comes up with this idea of compatibilism, which is seen as a middle ground. It's the idea that free will means having the freedom to express your determined personality. So we'll be looking at his quite unique understanding of what free will is. And again, we'll be looking at that in the context of moral responsibility. And I've put there as well that when we talk about him, we'll be linking to virtue ethics, because as I say, he's very interested in this idea of us having a personality and then freedom being the ability to express that personality in society. So lots to talk about. And I think just, to make it really clear to you, always, when you're thinking of these scholars in terms of free will and moral responsibility, you need to think, what is their idea? So are they a determinist? Are they a libertarian? Are they a compatibilist? And then what is the implication of that for moral responsibility? We have got to keep linking it back to this question of, so what would this mean in a courtroom? What is the implication of this when it comes to holding people to account for the choices they make, the decisions they make, and the things that they do? For example, if you go on to be a judge in the future and you are sentencing people for their crimes in that courtroom, which of these philosophers will be influencing your thinking? So let's get started with a little mind map. I do love a mind map, as my A-level students know. And I thought, let's actually take a step back and let's ask ourselves, how do we know right from wrong? Because, of course, if you're holding people responsible for the decisions they make, you want to think about how they're making those decisions. So how do we know right from wrong? You could say, of course, that it's an innate moral sense. So, for example, Augustine's idea that the conscience is that innate voice of God speaking to us. And so it's this innate sense that we actually find within. We could say we learn morality from society. And again, if we think back to the conscience topic, Kohlberg's idea of moral development is very much in line with that, isn't it? That idea that our morality and our conscience, as we would call it, is shaped in a cultural and social context. We could, of course, say people learn it from religion. So if we think about paper 2, when we look at those different principles of good conduct, those key moral principles, we have that key idea in religion that our holy books and that religious teachings, the Pope, for example, with his papal infallibility, are our authoritative source of morality. And then we could also say that they don't actually exist, that right and wrong don't objectively exist. And of course, that is a nice synoptic link to religious language and the idea of A.J. Ayer, and also that idea of meta-ethics as well, that actually when we're making moral statements, that they are factually meaningless. that actually they are just expressions of an emotion. They are a matter of personal opinion or feeling. So if we then take this further and consider this question of free will, I just want you to think for a moment, do you think that animals have free will? So when you look at the animal kingdom, you look at animals in the wild, do they have free will? And then I want you to also think, do machines have free will? And of course, questions about artificial intelligence are now in the news, aren't they? And so there are real questions about what artificial intelligence could lead to happening in years to come. But we really do need to consider whether animals have free will and whether machines have free will, so we can then think about, do human beings have free will? Because as I mentioned before, for Descartes, we do have free will because of this idea of mind-body dualism. So there is something unique about human beings. And for him, of course, it's the idea we've got that separate mind that is wholly dependent from the body, that very Platonic idea, isn't it? That means we can have free will. So we've got to think, what is it about human beings that mean they could potentially have free will in comparison, for example, to an animal or a machine? And so lastly, before we actually do dive into what libertarianism, determinism, and compatibilism are, I want to just share with you a quote from an old friend of ours, Aristotle, who we speak about a lot, don't we, for A-level RS? Because in his Nicomachean Ethics, he said that virtue is concerned with emotions and actions, and it is only voluntary feelings and actions for which praise and blame are given. So you will remember Aristotle's hierarchy of souls and the idea that humans are at the top because they've got that rational soul. They've got that ability to think for themselves, to reflect for themselves. And of course, that's all about the development of their virtues. It's about pursuing eudaimonia, and it's all about arete, excellence. And for Aristotle, it is really important that we can only be praised or blamed for things we have voluntarily done. So you can see here that free will is absolutely at the core of Aristotelian ethics, because we can only be praised and blamed for things we've voluntarily done. And actually, I wonder, do you agree with that? If you think about, the things people are praised or blamed for in society, are they being praised? I can't speak, excuse me. Are they being praised or blamed for things that they have voluntarily chosen? Or actually, do we see in society that people are, rewarded, they're celebrated for things that they haven't actually had to work hard for? Or at the same time, do people get blamed for things that actually they didn't voluntarily cause or have anything to do with? So for Aristotle, as I say, free will is very important for his morals, because we can only be praised or blamed for things that have been voluntary, by which he means we have freely chosen them. So the headlines here: Aristotle argued that only voluntary actions, so those that you do through your own free will, qualify for praise or blame. So to be morally responsible, people must act through their own free will. Their actions need to be the result, that should say there, I don't know why I've put rest, do excuse the typo. Their actions need to be the result of their free choices. And this would mean that if you are forced to do something and therefore have no option but to do it, or if you are ignorant about the significance of what you are doing, then you should not be held morally responsible, which of course is really important for us when we consider moral responsibility. So for moral responsibility, we need a free human agent. We need to be able to say that that person has acted freely. So for example, they've not been forced, they've not been hypnotized, they've not been brainwashed. They need to have made that conscious decision, and they need to have been capable of making that decision. So of course, if you are not able to make a free conscious choice, then you can't be held morally responsible for what you've done. And very interestingly, in the UK, in UK law, there are 3 levels of what we call legal responsibility. The first one is no responsibility, the second one is diminished responsibility, and then the third one is full responsibility. So I've got a couple of case studies for you here, and I want you to just think about each of these and whether you think that person should be held or can be held morally responsible. Are they fully responsible? Do they have diminished responsibility, or do they have no responsibility? And of course, the implication then is what happens in a courtroom. Should they be sent to jail for what they've done or not? So someone, case study 1, who while driving has a massive stroke without warning and with no medical history of strokes. So when they have that stroke, which has just come on, and as I say, they've never had one before, they lose all control of the car and they tragically then kill 2 children. So are they then fully responsible for the death, for the murder of those 2 children? Because of course, if they are, then that's going to be a very lengthy prison sentence, isn't it? But the question is, are they fully responsible because they've had a stroke without warning and they've got no medical history of stroke? So it's not like they'd had one the day before and then they chose to get in a car again. So a really interesting case study there about responsibility. A second one for you, someone who in self-defense kills an assailant who is threatening them with a knife. So again, are they fully responsible for what they've done? Should they actually, again, be put in jail for murder because they have killed someone who was threatening them with a knife? Are they under duress, for example? Do we need to take those circumstances into account? How was that moral agent influence there? And then finally, a woman who had suffered years of regular abuse from her partner suddenly snaps and kills him as he sleeps, although there had been no assault that evening. So it wasn't in direct response to something he'd done. So it wasn't an act of self-defense per se, but it was the culmination of years of abuse that then that person thought, I'm going to kill him. So really difficult, I think, in terms of making judgments here about moral responsibility. Again, I hope this is getting you thinking about this question of, are we morally responsible? What does it take for a moral agent to be held morally responsible for the things that they've done, for the decisions that they've made? Because, of course, in the UK, our legal system does assume we have free will because we do then hold people to account for the things that they've done. There are, however, 4 exemptions under UK law for those who are then seen as not fully responsible for what they've done. Number 1, those who have not yet learned it, which of course does then suggest that we learn right from wrong and that we learn to become morally responsible. So of course, again, quite consistent with Kohlberg's idea of moral development. We then have those who cannot understand it, those who have permanently forgotten it, for example, someone with dementia, and those who have temporarily forgotten it. So if they're under extreme pressure or the influence of drugs or alcohol, for example. So again, do have a think, do you think these are legitimate exemptions from being held morally responsible for what you've done or not? So after a nice little introduction there, we have finally made it to the key central part of today's video, which is looking at libertarianism, compatibilism, and hard determinism. So I'm going to give you an overview of the 3 of them now, and then we're going to go into each one in detail and apply it to moral responsibility. So yes, you might want to get the snacks ready. You might want to have a cup of tea on standby because we do have quite a lot to discuss today, but hopefully you will find this very interesting. So the first one is libertarianism. And this is the idea, very simply, that humans are free moral agents who have free will. Now, that's not to say we can do absolutely anything. Libertarians don't say that we can then choose to fly and just take off and fly off in the sky and then land somewhere down the road. They do accept that there are limitations from physical reasons, psychological reasons, and social reasons. There are things that we're restricted of doing or we're restricted from doing, but they say that we do have free will. And that is mainly based on the fact that they sense freedom. We have a sense of freedom. And so free will for a libertarian is a contingent truth. And very simply, that's just a working truth. It's a informed assumption based on our experience. We do feel like we can make moral decisions for ourselves. We do feel that we freely choose to do things. Now, determinists such as Spinoza are going to say that that's an illusion, but for free will advocates, so for a libertarian, they're satisfied that the fact that we have a sense of freedom can provide us with a working assumption, with a credible assumption, we do have free will. Now, as I mentioned before, many libertarians are mind-body dualists. They believe that we have got that physical body, but then we've also got that distinct mind substance. And that is where the free will is able to operate. We also have to consider, they do accept, they acknowledge we may be influenced, but those influences are not necessarily determinant. So they believe that we do, at the end of the day, have choice. And as I say, many are dualists because they believe that it is in that distinct, separate mind substance that we have that freedom and we have a sense of freedom. Now, in the middle of the two views is compatibilism, and this is the belief that human freedom is compatible with determinism. And our key thinker here is David Hume, and he has a great quote. He says there is a liberty of spontaneity, and we're going to explain what that means. But the important point here actually is that he redefines the term freedom based on this distinction between internal freedom and external freedom. So he believes that we should have external freedom, the freedom to express ourselves, the freedom to do what our personality has determined us to do. So as I say, David Hume is our key thinker. He says we have a liberty of spontaneity, the ability to do what we desire, which is determined by our personalities. So he does believe that we are determined by our personality, but then freedom means being able to act upon and express our personality, therefore our desires, without external restriction. So he's got a very interesting middle ground approach there, where he's kind of got a finger in both pies, if I can put it like that. And then finally, hard determinism. This is Spinoza's view that there is absolutely no free will. So that free will is actually an illusion. Everything that happens, including the decisions that we make, is the necessary consequence of a previous event. So moral choices are determined by early events we don't control. And as I say, Spinoza is our key figure here. He says that free will is an illusion. And of course, then the implication of this is we cannot claim moral responsibility for any of our actions because we've not actually chosen them. So you've got libertarianism, where of course we are going to be burdened with responsibility, to use that language of Sartre, that we are condemned to be free, whereas then hard determinism would be the opposite. We can't actually be held morally responsible because we have not freely chosen our actions. It's then interesting to consider Hume in the middle, the idea that freedom means being able to follow our desires and express our personalities without restriction. So to think about moral responsibility in that context. But yes, we're going to explore all three of them in further detail today. So let's do that now by starting with libertarianism. And as I mentioned at the start, Jean-Paul Sartre was an existentialist who was an example for us of a libertarian. Now, the existentialist movement was a philosophical movement developed in the 20th century that emphasized the existence of the individual person as a free and responsible agent, determining their own development through acts of the will. So existentialists are, of course, going to believe in free will. They believe that we are radically free. They believe that we are so free that it's not just about making moral choices for ourselves, but we actually decide the purpose of our entire lives. They believe that existence precedes essence, that we are born into this world, we are thrown into this world, and then we have to decide everything for ourselves, including what the purpose of our lives will be. So as I say, an existentialist would believe that existence precedes essence. Our lives have no inherent purpose. Instead, we must create or discover one for ourselves. And of course, as I say, that reflects their belief in this radical freedom and individual autonomy. So we mentioned at the start, Jean-Paul Sartre. He said that man is condemned to be free because once thrown into the world, he is responsible for everything he does. So he was one of the key figures of existentialism, and his primary idea is that humans are condemned to be free, by which we mean that we have not chosen this, but we have this radical freedom. And he says it is therefore up to everyone to create their own existence, for which they are then responsible. They cannot not be free. There is a form of necessity for freedom. So the irony there is that you have not chosen to be free, but you are now free. And so he sees that obviously as a responsibility. You could maybe say a burden. But for an existentialist, we are condemned to be free. So he says, when we become aware of our freedom as an inescapable given part of our human condition, the awareness is often accompanied by anxiety because we realize that this means we alone are now responsible for our choices and for the projects we undertake. You know, it's this idea that we are condemned to be free, that with free will, there is then this responsibility that is given to you. He says there is no moral absolute, there's no God, there's no divine will, there's no natural law. So of course Aquinas wouldn't like this because everything comes down to you. Because we have this radical freedom, we have complete free will, we have complete autonomy, we therefore have complete responsibility. And so I love this quote, and this is a great one to use if you're writing an essay on moral responsibility. He says, there are no excuses behind us and there are no justifications before us. We are completely and utterly free, which means we are completely and utterly responsible. And that is so important to remember when you're talking about libertarianism, when you're talking about moral responsibility. For a libertarian, you have got this idea that, yes, okay, we are free, but that means we are then fully responsible. So if we go back in time to Descartes and we talk about his idea of libertarianism, as I mentioned, this is very much anchored in his mind-body dualism and the idea we have this distinct mind substance, which is where that freedom is available to us. So he believed, as libertarians believe, that human beings are free moral agents who have free will. So here are the headlines. Many libertarians have been mind-body dualists who, following Descartes, explained human freedom by a separate mind substance that manages to act in the physical world. So, of course, we can see so many things in the world are determined in terms of the regularity of things. If you think about the design argument and those arguments about proving God's existence through the design, through the regularity in the universe, you know, the regularity of the day, the regularity of the year, for example. So many things do seem fixed. They work like clockwork, to build upon the watchmaker analogy. But of course, he is saying that because we've got that separate mind substance, we can be free. So even in a world that does have that fixity, that is rigid, that does seem determined, we can have freedom. Now, of course, religious libertarianism is something that we have looked at already on the course, because we've looked a lot at this idea of free will. We saw it with Augustine, for example, when he said a runaway horse is better than a stone. So many religious people do believe in libertarianism because they believe that God has given us free will. Of course, we know that this is a challenging idea, though, because of God's omniscience. So, of course, for religious libertarians, they have this philosophical debate and this problem of reconciling human free will with God's omniscience. And one example to give you is Boethius's solution that God exists in this fourth dimension, in this simultaneous present, where he sees the past, present, and future all in one simultaneous present. And that is his attempt to safeguard human free will and preserve God's omniscience. But in terms of libertarianism in general, it's this idea that human beings, for their unique reasons, have free will, even though much of what we see in the universe operates according to laws of cause and effect. We can have this freedom. We have got this free will, which means we are free moral agents, and so we can be held morally responsible. So talking of moral responsibility, remember Immanuel Kant, one of his three postulates for practical reason is free will. So in order for us to have autonomy as rational agents and as individual moral decision makers, we have to assume we possess free will. Remember, a postulate is a practical working assumption, because if we are not free agents, we cannot be held morally responsible for our moral actions. So that's a really great example, a great case study of how libertarianism works in practice, that for us to be held morally responsible, we have got to assume we have free will, that we have freely chosen what we have done. And then if we just develop this a little bit further, libertarianism rejects universal causation and claims that there is such thing as a causally undetermined choice. So that would say that choices are not random, but nor are they predetermined. So a libertarian does accept that our bodies are subject to causal laws and that we are influenced by nature and nurture. So, you know, a libertarian is not going to say that we should be able to just take off and fly. We have to accept there are still limitations, for example, because of our biology. So there are limitations, but ultimately, because of that mind-body distinction, we do have free will. So we are, of course, still limited by our bodies, and Descartes is the first person to acknowledge that as a dualist, but we still have that free will. And importantly, they believe that free will cannot be proved, but it can be accepted, like many things in life, as a contingent truth. So just to reinforce that idea, many libertarians are mind-body dualists. So please do feel free to make that link and make that reference in the exam. And this is how they believe in libertarianism, because they believe, as I say, you've got that separate mind substance that can then act freely in the physical world. Because when we look at the physical world, we see the laws of science, we see that regularity, we see cause and effect. But of course, you then want to be able to say why human beings are different. So as I said with Aristotle, and he talks about that rational soul, the hierarchy of souls, which means that we are more important, that we can have that thought, that reflection, that consideration. For Descartes, quite a similar idea. Human beings are unique because they've got that separate mind substance, and that enables them to have freedom even though they're in that physical world. And of course, they are aware that we are still constrained by that physical world, but ultimately in our mind, because of that separate, distinct mind substance, we do have free will. And as I say, libertarians do accept we cannot just fly, but remember, they do believe that we have free will, and so we are free moral agents. So of course, that means, and here is our application to crime and punishment, that you must reward and punish behaviour. It means that crime should be seen as the result of choice that is made in the mind, and so there must be punishment for it. And of course, we see this in the UK legal system. We looked at those case studies before, didn't we? The UK legal system is based on the understanding you could have chosen otherwise. You cannot put somebody in prison if they had no choice but to do what they did. So you have in the legal system there a great case study, a great example of a libertarian assumption. Again, nobody is proving free will. They're accepting it as a contingent truth, much like Kant does with his postulates. They are things that he assumes to be true for the sake of morality functioning and working. And of course, the UK legal system therefore does reflect the libertarian belief in free will. And so the key headline really with libertarianism, we see it with Sartre and we explain it with Descartes, and the idea of having that separate mind substance that gives us free will away from the physical world, is that we are fully responsible for all our actions and choices. So that is your libertarian view. We are now going to have a look at determinism, because this is then a great way to critique libertarianism. And I want to start by sharing with you a little extract from Spinoza's writing. And the first thing I want to say about Spinoza is look at those eyebrows. Quite impressive, let's be honest, for the 1600s. Let's talk, though, about what he says here, because this criticism that he makes here of libertarianism is brilliant for us in terms of critiquing libertarianism, but also for then understanding his belief in determinism and his belief that free will is an illusion. So he writes, conceive, I beg, that a stone, while continuing in motion, should be capable of thinking and knowing, that is, endeavouring, as far as it can, to continue to move. Such a stone, being conscious merely of its own endeavour and not at all indifferent, would believe itself to be completely free, and it would think that it continued in motion solely because of its own wish. This is that human freedom which all boast that they possess, and which consists solely in the fact that men are conscious of their own desire, but are ignorant of the causes whereby that desire has been determined. So he is saying here that we have no more freedom than a stone has freedom. So that is really important, and you can link that so well to Augustine's point that a runaway horse is better than a stone, because he's saying we are actually a stone. We have got no more freedom or free will than a stone rolling down a hill trying to stop itself. So he says, imagine that stone is rolling down the hill and that stone thinks that it's got free will, and that if it wanted to, it could stop itself. Spinoza is saying, of course it couldn't. It's impossible. It's not going to happen. He says that is the level of delusion that we have on a daily basis as human beings. We are ignorant of the causes whereby our desires have been determined. So he says we think that we've come up with them ourselves, but really they have been determined. So I'm just going to highlight that just to really emphasize it. So he says human beings are ignorant of the causes whereby that desire has been determined. So he is saying that that stone, as I say, is a great example of human beings, because he says what the stone thinks it has is that human freedom, which people like to boast that they have. But actually, we do not have freedom. We have no more freedom than a stone rolling down a hill trying to stop itself. Free will is an illusion. Free will is a delusion. So this is a really interesting argument, and I want us to think about not only what is determinism and this idea that everything is determined, so free will is an illusion, but then what is the implication? If we have no more freedom than a stone that is rolling down a hill, that obviously cannot stop itself from rolling down a hill, then how can we be held morally responsible for the things that we do and the choices that we actually don't make? Because those choices were not made by us, they were predetermined. The idea that we chose them is just an illusion. So let's have a look, shall we, at what Spinoza is saying. As I mentioned, free will is an illusion. All our moral choices are actually necessary consequences. So in other words, they're not choices. So I can't actually go around telling my students greatness is a choice, choose greatness, because they don't actually have any choices. That is all an illusion. So he was a Dutch rationalist philosopher, and he considered that everything in the world was totally determined by physical causes, and therefore there is no scope for human freedom. Now, of course, the response that Descartes would be making here is that because of dualism, we still have that free will because we've got that separate mind substance. So we're not completely constrained by the physical world and by physical causes. But for Spinoza, he wouldn't be buying that. Yeah, he would only be buying, you know, some nice eyebrow gel. He said that we only consider ourselves to be free because we are ignorant of all the causes operating on us. So free will is an illusion that is based on ignorance. So if we actually understood ourselves better, we would understand we don't make free choices. We would understand we don't have freedom. We don't have free will. Because he says freedom is an illusion generated by our ignorance of the totality of causes acting upon us. And again, that is a great phrase to drop in. Free will is an illusion generated by our ignorance of the totality of causes. You know, there are all of these causes, all of these influences that actually shape our decisions. So they're not decisions, they're necessary consequences. In other words, we couldn't have chosen otherwise. And of course, you know, libertarians do accept, as we said before, that we are influenced by nature and nurture, and we are limited by the physical world, but they maintain that we do still have free will. Spinoza does not believe that is the case. Instead, he says that if we could take into account everything that had ever happened to us, every experience that etched neural pathways into our brain, then we would understand that our choices have been determined. So we aren't choosing them, they are consequences. So that's going to require you going all the way back to your childhood and thinking, you know, how was I influenced? How was I shaped? What happened in my childhood, which means what I've chosen to do now is a necessary consequence of that. Now, I think this is fascinating for anyone that wants to go on to do criminology, because you are going to look, aren't you, at the childhood influences on crime. You know, if you look back at the history, you see those Channel 5 shows, don't you, where it's like the making of a murderer, and they do a deep dive into their upbringing, and they're like, when he was 4, somebody stole his Kit Kat off him, and that was it. That's why he's now a mass murderer. You know, obviously, I'm not saying it's exactly like that. Well, it's definitely not like that, is it? But my point is, psychologists, criminologists do look at the influences. But then it's interesting, our justice system does then still say, as Descartes would still say, that we do have a choice, that we could have chosen otherwise. Spinoza is arguing we can never choose otherwise, that we are totally determined, we are totally predetermined, to use the word again, apologies, by what's happened to us and by other factors beyond our control. So we have no free will. Freedom is simply an illusion. So of course, be thinking now, what is the implication of this for the legal system? What is the implication of this for the justice system? It means the entire UK legal system is completely wrong, and it needs to be completely reformed, because we can't hold anybody responsible. Never mind saying some people have diminished responsibility, nobody has any responsibility. So just to give you a bit more detail on this, traditional hard determinism is based on the concept of universal causation. Nothing is random and nothing is free. So many hard determinists adopt what we call a reductionist. That's where you reduce everything down to its basic parts. A reductionist approach that human behavior can be reduced to the laws of physics. So of course, you're not going to be thinking there about that mind substance that is separate. You're going to be saying that our apparent freedom to choose is an illusion. And I've got another great quote from Spinoza here, actually. He said that free will is dreaming with our eyes open. So it is an illusion, it is a delusion. And of course, you may have come across before the phrase scientific determinism. This is the idea that in the universe, everything is determined by a chain of cause and effect. And then for a determinist, they would apply that to human beings as well. Everything, including our choices, well, they aren't choices, are they? Everything, including the delusion of choices, is just necessary consequences. There is no scope for human free will. Everything is predetermined. Everything is a necessary consequence of something that's already happened. So we do not choose things. We do not decide things. They are necessary consequences. And we also see this, if anyone's doing A-level psychology, you will instantly recognize this image on the screen. We also see this in something called behaviorism, which is a psychological approach. And psychological behaviorism is the idea that all human behavior is caused predominantly by environmental conditions, and that actions are conditioned by previous ones. So two very famous psychologists, Pavlov and Skinner, demonstrated this with dogs in Pavlov's case, and then rats, excuse me, in Skinner's case. They both studied animal behavior and found that behavior is conditioned by experiences. Behavior is learned responses. So, you know, when you say your dog's name and they look up at you, or when your dog knows it's dinner time, they are conditioned by stimulus and response. Now, of course, I asked you before, didn't I? Do you think that human beings have free will? Do you think that animals have free will? For a determinist, they would say that we are, just like animals, unable to decide things. Our choices are just necessary consequences, which you could predict, you would know are going to happen in advance, because behavior is just learned, conditioned responses. It is necessary consequences. And Skinner, for example, famously said, behavior is determined by its consequences. So by the reinforcement that we receive, or the reinforcement we see other people receiving. So we don't have free will. We are determined, we are controlled, we are entirely influenced. We don't have free will. Free will is an illusion. And if we then link in theological determinism, remember we have mentioned theological libertarianism, but then we can mention theological determinism. And this, of course, is rooted in the Christian idea that God is omniscient. And of course, we've looked at Augustine and Calvin when we've talked about predestination. And of course, we've spoken about the fact that if God is all-knowing, then God must know the entire past, present, and future of the universe and humanity. So John Calvin, believes that God's omniscience means some people are eternally ordained to glory through the sheer will of God, and the rest are ordained to eternal torment. Now, of course, the big problem with this is it then goes against things like the parable of the sheep and the goats, for example, which is Jesus's teaching that those who have chosen to feed the hungry, give drink to the thirsty, clothe the naked, invite strangers in, care for the sick, and visit those in prison, those who have chosen to do that will be rewarded. Those who have chosen not to will be punished. But of course, theological determinism, in line with all kinds of determinism, would say we don't have any free will. Everything is predetermined. Everything that happens is just a necessary consequence over which we have no autonomy and choice. So, of course, we do see this in those ideas of predestination. That is very much in line with the idea of things being predetermined. And of course, our question is, does this reflect how God operates? Remember, I said Boethius reconciles God's omniscience with free will by saying he exists in that simultaneous present, and he sees the past, present, and future all at the same time. But of course, here Calvin, Augustine, seen here taking a different view and actually arguing that God's omniscience means everything is determined. And that, of course, reinforces God's supremacy, God's importance, and God's omniscience, of course. So interesting, again, to apply that to theology. But of course, the most important application for us is to crime and punishment. Because, of course, as I say, this completely undermines and it completely contradicts the foundations of our justice system in the UK, doesn't it? Because hard determinism would mean there can be no freedom of the kind required for moral responsibility, which is a massive problem for courts, It is a massive problem for our legal system because it would be pointless to punish people for doing things that were determined and therefore unavoidable. If you're saying that what they've done is a necessary consequence, then how can you then hold them to account for it? You know, we can't, in other words, we can't put someone in prison for murdering or stealing if we're saying they didn't actually choose to do that. They were actually as much of a victim, if you like, because it was a necessary consequence. So as I've put into a question here, if human behavior is determined, then how can you be punished for doing things? And if we then link in theological determinism as well, that's obviously then the idea that God doesn't then judge us and send us to heaven and hell based on our actions, but he actually predetermines. And that, of course, is predestination. But of course, our critique, is that it would be unfair for God to have already predetermined who is going to heaven and who is going to hell when he's not seen them do anything. He's not got any evidence for that at all. Although, of course, you could say he's omniscient. He already knew whether they were going to heaven or hell at the beginning of time. So really big questions here. But I think the headline for me, in terms of the application, is that determinism means we can't be held responsible. We don't have free will, obviously. And so we don't have responsibility because what we thought were choices are actually necessary consequences. So if free will is an illusion, our entire legal system needs a complete overhaul. So, you know, someone needs to get started with that, really, if you do think Spinoza could be onto something. So let's have a look now at our third and final approach, shall we? Which, as we've said, is that middle ground. It's Hume, it's the liberty of spontaneity, and it's called compatibilism. So there he is, David Hume. And the idea of compatibilism is that human freedom and moral responsibility is compatible with determinism. So essentially, he wants to have his cake and eat it. He wants to believe in both. And he does that quite cleverly by proposing a new definition of freedom. So he believes that we need to rethink what we mean when we talk about freedom. So a compatibilist, such as David Hume, and this is your headline, believes that we are free when we can act according to our desires. So that is what freedom is. Now, that's not to say we freely choose our desires, but it is to say freedom is acting according to them. So freedom is the ability to do what we want and we desire. Now, as I say, those desires are not random. So it's not like libertarianism, where, as an existentialist would say, you have to even pick your purpose, that you absolutely decide every single thing. Hume, compatibilists, let me get the word right, in general, believe those desires are not random. It is our personality which determines our will, but then freedom is our freedom to act according to that. So here we are. According to Hume, freedom means being able to express your desires, and your desires flow from your personality without interference or restriction. And as I say, the key quote that I want to see you use in any paragraph on compatibilism is liberty of spontaneity. So let's just unpack that a bit more. He wrote that by liberty, we can only mean a power of acting or not acting according to the determinations of the will. That is the worst bit of highlighting I've ever done. I really do apologize. I really am quite offended by how awfully I've done that, but I'm going to continue. That is, if we choose to remain at rest, we may. If we choose to move, we also may. But of course, whether you rest or move is going to be based on your personality. Are you a lazy person? Are you an active person? So that is determined. Your personality is determined. Your desires are determined by your personality. Whereas your freedom, the idea of freedom, of human freedom, is whether you can then act upon that, or whether you are going to be forced to go and do exercise even though you don't want to, because your personality is lazy, so your desire is to stay in bed and watch Netflix all day and eat chocolate. Now, this hypothetical liberty is universally allowed to belong to everyone who is not a prisoner and in chains. Now, of course, that's important because remember, he said that freedom is the ability to do what you want, to act on your desires. So the only people that don't have that are people in prison. So really important to actually look at that primary quote there and really think about what Hume means. So if we just unpack this a bit more, I think Oliver McAdoo puts this really well in a great, really easy way to understand. So he said, Hume claims that our freedom, and this is the quote, lies in being able to carry out our desires without interference and restraint from external factors. So that is the key core concept, really, at the heart of compatibilism. Freedom is being able to carry out our desires, which are determined without interference and restraint from external factors. On this basis, freedom is not only compatible with determinism, it requires it. It is essential that our desires are not random, that they flow from our personality that is genuinely our own. And our personality or character is the sum total of the causal conditions that have created us. Freedom is the expression of this character to act according to one's desires. Now, of course, this is where you can link in with virtue ethics, because you can say this demonstrates why virtue ethics is so important, because you want to give people the freedom to act in accordance with their desires, which is an expression of their personality. So you want them to have a good personality. And of course, virtue ethics is all about the cultivation of character so that you can then have the freedom to do the right thing. So this shows us how important personality is and how important character is, because freedom means being able to act in accordance with your character, to be able to act on your desires, to do what you want to do. And of course, the assumption there is that your personality is going to be virtuous, that you are going to be a good person, so that freedom means you can act upon that, you can act in accordance with that. So it is important that we're always making those links and connections across the course. So he goes on to say, non-freedom for a compatibilist is not being able to do what I desire because I am forced to do something else through physical restraint or coercive interference. And again, that puts it really nicely that freedom for a compatibilist is being able to do what I desire. So that is really important that we remember that for a compatibilist, freedom takes on this different meaning and this different definition. For a compatibilist, freedom means being able to do what I desire, and that is going to flow from your personality, and it's being able to act upon your impulses, act upon your desires without interference and restraint. So I think a great way of putting this is to think of this as like a person who goes onto stage and is able to perform what they want. They're not walking onto that stage, you know, imagine it's the Britain's Got Talent audition. They're not going onto that stage and then Ant and Dec are there and they tell them, right, you've got to go on and you've got to sing this song, or you've got to do this dance, you've got to tell this joke. It's the idea that freedom in that case would be you with your personality, with your own skills, talents and interests, being able to walk out on that stage and perform what comes naturally to you. You have that liberty of spontaneity, that it can come from the heart, as we'd say, that you can do what is natural for you. You can give an authentic performance because you are expressing your personality, following your desires, that you don't have to go on that stage and do a certain routine, act in a certain way, sing a certain song. That is what freedom is. So our personality determines our desires, the things or actions we want to do. Freedom means being able to perform these actions without interference, without, for example, physical restraint. So, of course, you can see here how Hume, as I said, has got a finger in both pies, really, because he's recognizing we are determined by our personalities, but then he's accepting that libertarian sentiment that we have the freedom to choose to act or not to act. So that is where compatibilism comes in, where we're building that bridge across the two approaches. So what does this mean in the courtroom? What is our application, again, to moral responsibility? Well, here's the important bit. Here's the headline. Compatibilists believe, I can't even say the word, excuse me, that's really bad. Compatibilists believe, I'll try that again, we are morally responsible as long as moral choices are not the results of external restrictions. So as long as we've not been restrained or coerced. So we do have freedom. People are blameworthy if their choices come from their characters. People's actions are judged insofar as they are indications of the internal character. And so, of course, reward and punishment is important for cultivating good character and encouraging virtue in a society. Now, of course, we could have a really interesting debate and discussion here about, well, where does personality come from? If your personality is determined, then actually, are you free? Do you have free will? But we could argue that because of virtue ethics, which shows us how good character can be developed, we can actually say people are free. And remember, for Aristotle, we can only be praised or blamed for things that we've voluntarily chosen to do. So for a compatibilist, we can say you are morally responsible as long as you weren't coerced into what you're doing, or you weren't restrained in some way from doing what you thought was the right thing to do. And of course, that is different from determinists, because they believe that even if we did have freedom in society, we still aren't responsible for what we've done, because we are fully determined within as well. So really interesting to be thinking about this application. You know, if you think about whether libertarians have got it right, determinists have got it right, or compatibilists have got it right. But please do let me know any questions, any thoughts, any comments, and any judgments, of course, that you have about these approaches. Your job now then is to start critiquing them. Which do you think is the best? Which is the most helpful when applied to moral responsibility? What flaws can you see with each approach? What strengths can you find? And that is really important to do before going into the exam, to ensure that if you are asked an AO2 evaluation question on these different approaches, you are ready to identify what works. For example, that libertarianism is consistent with the justice system, and then you also find what doesn't work, what problems there are. For example, can you critique determinism by saying that it would completely undermine the justice system? So plenty to think about. As I say, let me know any questions, any comments down below. Thank you for watching, and very good luck with your revision.